Thank you, Corinne. And first of all, I'd really like to thank CRS, the Center for Resource Solutions, and the Green Marketplace for being such a great sponsor for your contributions in the area of green labeling. We really appreciate working with you and the opportunity here to talk about supply chain carbon accounting. So with that, I'd like to turn to Climate Earth and just give the audience a little bit of a background on our company. We really started looking at supply chain analysis back in 2007 when we were getting the company started. And we did our first full supply chain analysis in 2008 with a company called Playworld Systems. I think today we're seeing a tremendously growing recognition that supply chain analysis is becoming extremely critical. It's 70 to 90% of most companies' carbon footprints, and the implications for not managing that are certainly significant. We're also seeing that, a lot of concern about the complexity in managing the supply chain carbon footprint, but what we're going to be focusing on today is that with the right tools and the right systems, working with your suppliers, developing a strategy for transparency and visibility can actually be achieved quite efficiently. So if we look into our topics more specifically, we're really focusing on how supply chain mapping, that is the initial hotspot analysis, can be utilized as a business tool to develop pretty comprehensive strategies in your supply chain. Corinne Reich-Weiser, who's with me today, and our Director of Research, is going to be going through some specific industry case studies, and then of course we'll open everything up for questions. I'd like to begin, though, by giving you a perspective on Climate Earth. We offer what we call a full-service carbon accounting solution. It's quite different than a lot of the software solutions that are out there today. It's full service in the sense that we focus on collecting and measuring your carbon data throughout your supply chain and your enterprise, including Scope 1 and 2. We work with you closely to develop reports, and then we assign a dedicated carbon accountant that can advise you on the meaning and implications of those reports. This frees our clients to focus on planning their strategies, taking actions, and reviewing their business. So, and I'd like to remind everybody that carbon accounting really is a cyclical process. It's a continuous, ongoing management process. I mentioned that supply chain is becoming much more strategic, and I think that's evident in a large part because the World Resource Institute and WBCSD in the latter part of last year in December announced and released the draft supply chain and product standard protocols, which are now in full road test with about 60 companies around the world. It's really helped raise the visibility. I think most of you are familiar with Walmart's interest and strategic focus on supply chain analysis, not only for carbon but for water and other environmental metrics as well. We're starting to see a growing interest through industry forums such as the Scope 3 Carbon Accounting Summit coming up in London in June. And we're seeing events like Cemex in the concrete and cement business announcing that they're doing full carbon labeling of their cement products. And last of all, I think it's really important to mention that the major reporting agencies such as the Carbon Disclosure Project and the Climate Registry are now beginning to offer supply chain reporting and emphasizing with their members the importance of supply chain. So before I turn the podium over to Corinne, I'd like to talk a little bit about the relevance of supply chain. As we mentioned, it's typically 70 to 90% of an organization's footprint. We're going to be focusing on the upstream aspects of carbon accounting today, though our systems also support the downstream impacts, that is, what happens in the use phase of the products. It's a very complex process in analyzing the supply chain, much more complex, a lot more data involved than the focus on your Scope 1 and 2. And we're going to be addressing how to dig into that complexity, make it simple, and develop strategies. I also want to emphasize that we're not going to be looking at the full cycle of strategy development. This chart outlines the best practices for supply chain strategy. It begins with a full mapping, analysis of that mapping, and then looking at strategic options and iterating on those options before you finalize a specific strategy that's designed for your specific company, and then moving into the communication and action phases. But what we want to do today is emphasize through the case studies the power that supply chain mapping tools can bring to the problem of understanding your supply chain and beginning to focus on strategies and implications for reductions. So with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Corinne.
Thank you very much, Chris. So we've been talking about supply chain mapping, and I'd like to take a minute just to step back and discuss what is supply chain mapping. What does it mean? So we describe it as essentially moving upstream through your supply chain and calculating the carbon footprint from each of your suppliers, as well as from your suppliers' suppliers and your suppliers' suppliers' suppliers, all the way back to material extraction. And I think this is a really fun process, and I had a lot of fun putting together the case studies that we'll go through in a moment. But first I want to point out that while we are talking about greenhouse gases and carbon today, this can be done for any environmental impact, and you can find hotspots of where water usage is happening. You can find hotspots of toxic emissions. So we've chosen greenhouse gases today as kind of a subset of the greater application for supply chain environmental mapping. So how do we do this? Well, there are multiple ways that people can try to look back into their supply chain. And this usually seems like a really scary, complex, daunting task to take on as a company. How could you possibly go talk to all of your suppliers and get their information, and then are you really going to be able to go to your suppliers' suppliers, and how are you actually going to pull all of this together? So at Climate Earth, we start by doing what we call a screening approach, and this is advocated by the World Resources Institute's Scope 3 standard. And the idea is to use a database to put together kind of an estimate of where hotspots are happening in your supply chain, and then use this estimate of hotspots to figure out what suppliers actually are worth going to talk to, rather than trying to talk to everybody and build up a picture from the bottom up. So the way we do this is we have a database. It's an input-output database, and it gives us a view into the U.S. economy. This database is built up of input-output tables that tell us how much every industry is buying from every other industry in the U.S. economy. So for example, we could look in at an automobile manufacturer and see how much money they're spending on stampings and how much money the stamping supplier is spending on aluminum and how much is being spent on smelting. And we can quickly see how a dollar trickles down throughout the economy. And when we layer on top of this environmental data from the EPA, for example, we can quickly see how a dollar trickling through the economy leads to greenhouse gas emissions throughout the economy. So this gives us a quick snapshot into greenhouse gas emissions per dollar for 480 sectors of the U.S. economy. And what we typically do when we work with a company is we would take the company's financial information, which tells us all of the different services and commodities and materials that are flowing into the company, and we map this to the input-output database to come up with this initial screening or supply chain mapping that I'll be talking about. Today, we're giving more generic case studies where we're looking into our database at, for example, automobile manufacturing on average across the United States, and we'll identify what the average hotspots are for a few different industries.